It began with a single ink smudge on a birth certificate from 1892, a triviality, or so the archivists in the basement of the Cook County Records Office told me. They spoke of moisture, of poor storage, of the inevitable decay of cellulose and carbon. But as I traced the erratic line of the fountain pen, I realized the smudge wasn't an accident of time. It was an act of precision. Underneath the darkened blot lay a word that officially no longer existed in the geographic lexicon of the late 19th century. It wasn't a city. It wasn't a county. It was a designation of origin that defied the maps hanging on the walls upstairs. Ask yourself why a clerk in Chicago would feel the need to redact the birthplace of a bricklayer from the Eurasian steppe. Ask yourself why the ink used to hide that word is chemically distinct from the ink used to record the name. Not a mistake, not a spill, a correction. We are taught to believe that history is a solid foundation, a series of heavy stones laid one atop the other by the victors. But what if the foundation is actually a hollow shell? What if the very documents that verify our existence, our registries, our census data, our certificates of life, are actually the tools of a sophisticated global erasure? I found myself staring at that smudge for hours, feeling the weight of a ghost empire pressing against the paper. The deeper I looked, the more the anomalies began to hum. A birth here, a death there, a marriage in a town that has no record of ever being incorporated. Not a glitch in the system. The system itself is the glitch. The architecture of our cities tells a story that the history books are desperate to contradict. Walk through the financial district of any major American metropolis and look at the stone. Look at the way the granite meets the pavement. You will see windows half buried in the earth, arched tops peeking out from the sidewalk like gasping mouths. They call them light wells. They tell us it was a design choice for subterranean ventilation. But look closer at the load distribution. Look at the sheer mass of the masonry. These are not basements. These are the ground floors of a civilization that was buried in situ. We are told these structures were built in the 1880s by men with horse-drawn carts and primitive pulleys. We are asked to believe that a fledgling nation, still bleeding from a civil war, had the surplus capital and the aesthetic vanity to build neoclassical cathedrals for the purpose of sorting mail and selling grain. It is a narrative of absurdity. Not this, not that. Something else. When you examine the municipal registries of these same cities, you find a curious pattern of catastrophic fires occurring precisely when the construction of these impossible buildings was supposedly finalized. Chicago, 1871. Boston, 1872. Seattle, 1889. San Francisco, 1906. Each time the records are vaporized. Each time the registry of the old world is reset to year zero. What remains is a curated reality, a world where the grand remnants of the Tartarian horizon are rebranded as the spoils of the Industrial Revolution. We are squatters in the ruins of a giant's palace, convinced we built the walls ourselves. Consider the census of 1890. It is a vacuum in American history. They tell us a fire at the Commerce Department in 1921 destroyed nearly the entire collection of original schedules, a convenient tragedy. It leaves a 10-year gap in the genealogical record of a nation during its most volatile period of expansion and reconstruction. What was in those papers that required their total incineration? I suspect it wasn't just names and ages. I suspect it was the evidence of a population that didn't fit the Darwinian timeline we've been sold. We see hints of it in the surviving fragments, the foundling hospitals that cropped up like mushrooms in every major city, the orphan trains that moved hundreds of thousands of children from the East Coast into the interior. Ask yourself where these children came from. Ask yourself why their parentage was systematically scrubbed from the birth registries. They were the inheritors of the silence. They were the new generation, stripped of their lineage, re-educated in the shadow of the very star forts and domed capitals they were told their pioneer ancestors built. It is a masterclass in institutional gatekeeping. If you control the registry of birth, you control the definition of the self. If you tell a child they are the product of a vacuum, they will never look for the empire beneath their feet. The term Tartary appears on every major map produced before the mid-1800s. It spans the vastness of northern Asia, a sovereign entity of immense scale and technological sophistication. Then, with a suddenness that should alarm any serious scholar, it vanishes. It is partitioned, renamed, and relegated to the status of a geographic myth, or a loose collection of nomadic tribes. But nomadic tribes do not build power plants that utilize atmospheric electricity. They do not construct hexagonal bastions with such mathematical precision that they can be seen from a low Earth orbit. The erasure of Tartaria from the collective consciousness required a multi-generational psychological operation. It required the birth registry. By the 1890s, the children of the old world were being registered under new flags, new ethnicities, and new histories. The survivors of the great upheaval, whatever it was, were silenced by the necessity of survival. You do not speak of the old empire when the new one provides the bread. You do not mention the wireless energy or the gilded spires when the new curriculum says you were lucky to escape the mud. The somber reality is that we are living in a post-reset world, walking through the corridors of a forgotten global network, using the very tools of our suppression to document our own ignorance. I tracked a specific lineage of these foundings to a remote archive in the Appalachian foothills. There, I found a series of ledgers that had escaped the 1921 purge. The handwriting was cramped, the ink fading, but the data was chilling. These weren't just orphans. They were categorized by cranial capacity and aptitude for integration. The registries didn't just record their existence, they managed their erasure. Each child was given a clean slate certificate, a document that effectively severed their connection to any history preceding the year 1885. What if the great exhibitions, the world's fairs of the late 19th century, weren't celebrations of progress, but massive demolition projects? Think about the White City in Chicago, a sprawling metropolis of marble and light, supposedly built in months and destroyed by fire shortly after. Ask yourself why they would burn such beauty, or rather, ask yourself if it was ever meant to be temporary. The registries show that thousands of workers lived on site, yet none of them appear in the local census. They were ghosts in the machine, tasked with stripping the technology from the old Tartarian structures before the dynamite was set. Not progress, not innovation, something else. A controlled demolition of the past to make room for the narrative of the present. The tension in these archives is palpable. You can feel the institutional resistance as you move from one floor to the next. The librarians watch. The digitized databases have dead zones where certain keywords trigger a system freeze. Tartaria, atmospheric energy, mud flood. These are the trigger words of the hidden world. I spoke to a former clerk who worked in the National Archives in the late 70s. He told me about the redacted suites, rooms where documents weren't just filed, but chemically treated to ensure they would crumble within 50 years. This is the institutional erasure of the physical record. But the registry is harder to kill. It lives in the blood. It lives in the DNA of the millions who feel an inexplicable sense of displacement, a longing for a home that doesn't appear on any modern globe. We are the descendants of a silenced epoch. Every time you fill out a form, every time you verify your identity with a state-issued number, you are reinforcing the walls of your own cage. You are accepting the clean slate. The pattern is a global. It isn't just America. From the pyramids of Giza to the cathedrals of Russia, the narrative is the same. Primitive people, unlikely tools, and a sudden, inexplicable leap in architectural genius. But the math doesn't lie. The load distribution of the St. Petersburg cathedrals is impossible for the era of their supposed construction. The alignment of the star forts across the European and American continents suggests a unified global defense and energy grid that predates the invention of the telegraph. And yet, the registries of the 19th century claim these were the works of local sovereigns. It is a theft of heritage on a planetary scale. They took the world, they scrubbed the names off the doors, and they moved in. Then they made it illegal to remember who the previous tenants were. They used the birth certificate as the ultimate gag order. If you aren't on the paper, you don't exist. If the empire isn't on the paper, it never was. What if the Dark Ages were not a period of ignorance, but a period of intentional shadow? What if the Renaissance was not a rebirth, but the beginning of the cover-up? The investigative essayist must be skeptical of every date, every monarch, every treaty. We see the influence of this hidden hand in the very way we measure time. The Gregorian calendar shift, the phantom years inserted into the medieval record, it all points to a desperate attempt to distance us from a high technology past. The birth registry is the final anchor. It moors us to the 1800s, preventing our consciousness from drifting back into the golden age of Tartaria. We are told our ancestors were peasants, dying of plague and ignorance. But the stone tells a different story. The stone speaks of resonance, of frequency, of a world where light didn't come from a wire, but from the very air itself. Not this, not that. Something else. The unsettling truth is that the evidence is hidden in plain sight. It's in the antique tech we see on the tops of old buildings, the iron finials and copper domes that have no functional purpose in a world of fossil fuels, but look remarkably like capacitors. It's in the Great Reset of the 1800s, where the world was remapped and repeopled while the ink was still wet on the new registries. We are invited to investigate, but only within the parameters they have set. We are allowed to look at the ruins, but only if we call them monuments. We are allowed to study the orphans, but only if we call them pioneers. But as I sit in this dim light, looking at a map of a world that shouldn't exist, I realize the gatekeepers are afraid. They are afraid of the smudge on the birth certificate. They are afraid of the person who asks why. The final realization is the most provocative. The erasure isn't over. It is ongoing. Every time a historical building is demolished to make way for a glass box, the registry is updated. Every time a library is digitized and the physical copies are recycled, the past is filtered. We are being funneled into a future where the only history is the one that can be stored on a server and edited with a keystroke. The Tartarian Empire wasn't just lost, it was deleted. And we, the children of the reset, are the ones tested with clicking confirm. Ask yourself, who are you really? If you strip away the certificate, the number, and the state-sanctioned name, what ancient imperial blood still flows through your veins? The silence is heavy, but the stones are starting to wake up. What if the next reset is already beginning? What if the registry is about to be cleared again? The registry is not merely a collection of names, it is a boundary wall. To understand the scale of the enclosure, one must look at the silence of the 1840s. In every major European capital and across the burgeoning hubs of the American West, there is a synchronized pulse of civil unrest. We are taught to see these as isolated revolutions, the birth pangs of modern democracy, but look at the architectural casualties. Look at the specific buildings targeted for renovation or modernization in the wake of these conflicts. The administrative centres, the grand libraries, the vaulted halls of record, they were purged, not by the mobs, but by the restorers. The investigators of the new era did not come to find the truth, they came to provide a replacement. Ask yourself why the technical manuals for the construction of the Capitol domes are missing or incomplete. Ask yourself why the architects of these masterpieces often had no prior record of large-scale masonry. Not geniuses, not visionaries, placeholders. They were names written into the registry to occupy the space left by the architects of Tartary. It is a form of identity theft that spans continents. The global pattern suggests a coordinated strike against a specific type of knowledge, a science of resonance and stone that the new masters could not replicate, so they chose to bury it under a layer of bureaucratic fiction. Consider the phenomenon of the Star Fort. These massive, geometrically perfect bastions are scattered across the globe, from the coast of Florida to the heart of Russia, from the plains of South Africa to the islands of Japan. We are told they were defensive fortifications designed to deflect cannon fire, a pseudo-academic explanation that crumbles under the slightest engineering scrutiny. The complexity of their fractal designs, the precision of their water-filled moats, and their alignment with telluric currents suggest a function far beyond ballistics. They were the nodes of a global energy grid, the literal power plants of the Tartarian world. And yet, if you look at the military registries of the mid-19th century, these ancient structures are suddenly commissioned as if they were new. They are given names of generals who never stepped foot in them. They are outfitted with primitive cannons that look like toys against the backdrop of such sophisticated masonry. This is the erasure trope in its most physical form. The conquerors move into the power plant, call it a fort, and rewrite the birth registry of the building itself. If you change the purpose of a structure in the record, you change the history of the people who built it. What if the mud flood was not a singular event, but a series of regional catastrophes used to facilitate this transition? The evidence is literally under our feet. In London, in Rome, in New York, the excavations for subways and sewers continually reveal a world beneath the world. Intact doorways 10 feet underground, ornate facades buried in layers of sterile clay. The official explanation is street levelling. They tell us the 19th century city dwellers simply grew tired of the mud and decided to raise the entire city by one story. They ask us to believe this was done with hand jacks and horsepower, while the daily life of the city continued uninterrupted. It is a narrative of desperation, not street levelling, not urban planning, a cover-up. The registries from this period show an explosion in public works spending, a massive financial shunt that likely funded the literal burying of the old world's remains. When the mud settled, the new registry was opened, the survivors were given new identities, and the lower floors of the Tartarian palaces were rebranded as basements. We are walking on the roofs of our own heritage. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very concept of the Industrial Revolution. We are told that humanity went from candles to electricity in the blink of an eye, spearheaded by a few inventors whose names are etched into our textbooks. But when you examine the patents of the late 1800s, you see a strange pattern of refinement rather than invention. It is as if Edison, Tesla, and Marconi were not creating something new, but rediscovering the remnants of a shattered system. The registries of the world's fairs are particularly revealing. These ephemeral cities were powered by thousands of electric lights years before the average home had a single bulb. Where did the generators go? Where was the coal being burned? The answer is nowhere. They were tapping into the atmospheric energy that the Tartarian architecture was designed to harvest. The fairs were the final demonstrations of the old power, a going out of business sale for a civilization that had already been liquidated. After the gates closed, the buildings were dynamited, and the technology was classified. The registry was updated to show that progress was a slow, linear climb, rather than a sudden fall from a height we can no longer imagine. I found a letter in a private collection written by a surveyor in the 1870s. He spoke of finding cities of stone in the American Midwest that were not built by any tribe known to the government. He described buildings with glass that glowed without fire and pavements of a single piece. Within 6 months, the surveyor was institutionalized and his records were seized. This is the institutional gatekeeping in action. The asylums of the 19th century weren't just for the mentally ill, they were for the remembers. They were for the people who refused to accept the new registry. When you look at the census data, the insanity rates among the older generation during the 1880s are staggering. Were they losing their minds, or were they losing their world? The somber reality is that the Great Reset required the removal of the living witnesses. Those who could not be re-educated were sequestered. Their stories were scrubbed from the journals, and their names were struck from the lineage of the new generation. The staccato beat of this investigation leads us to a chilling conclusion. We are being farmed for our ignorance. The modern education system is a refinement of the foundling curriculum. It is designed to ensure that we never look up at the copper finials or down at the buried windows. It uses technical terms and academic prestige to shame anyone who notices the anomalies. Load distribution, they say, to explain away the impossible weight of the stones. Institutional gatekeeping, I say, to explain why the math doesn't add up. The rhythm of the erasure is constant, a low-frequency hum that vibrates through our media and our monuments. It tells us that we are small. It tells us that we are new. It tells us that there was nothing before the registry. But the contrast of scale is too great to ignore. A culture that builds with plywood and drywall cannot explain a culture that built with granite and frequency. Ask yourself why the Grand Canyon was once marked on early maps as the site of ancient cities. Ask yourself why the Smithsonian Institution has a history of losing artifacts that suggest a transoceanic Tartarian presence. Not accidents, not mismanagement, a policy of erasure. The registry of the earth itself is being edited. The very soil is a document, and the curators are busy burning the pages they don't like. We see the patterns in the national park system, vast tracts of land where entry is restricted and ruins are off limits. What is being protected? The nature or the evidence? The first-person investigator learns to trust the silence more than the noise. The noise is the narrative. The silence is where the truth is buried. The inquisitive mind must eventually confront the unresolved loop. If Tartaria was so vast, so advanced, and so integrated into the global grid, how could it fall? Was it a weapon? Was it a natural cataclysm? Or was it a betrayal from within? The registries hint at a global treaty of the 1800s, a secret agreement among the emerging royal families and industrial titans to divide the spoils of the old world. They didn't win a war. They inherited a collapse. They found the empire in ruins, perhaps after a celestial event or a catastrophic failure of the energy grid, and they decided to claim it as their own. They didn't build the world, they just changed the locks. And then they hired the historians to tell us the keys had always been theirs. The unsettling nature of this knowledge is that it changes the way you see everything. A trip to the post office becomes an exercise in urban exploration. A walk through a park becomes a search for the outlines of a buried star fort. The direct conspiratorial address of the stones is louder than any documentary. They are screaming their origin. They are begging to be recognized. But the registry is a heavy blanket. It muffles the sound. It smooths over the cracks. It tells you to go back to sleep, to go back to your desk, to go back to being a foundling in a world of giants. We are approaching the end of the paper trail, but the investigation is far from over. The evidence is not just in the archives, it is in the discrepancy between what we see and what we are told. It is in the tense, mysterious gaps in our own family trees. Who were your great-great-grandparents, really? Where is the record of their birth? Not the copy. The original. Not the typed summary. The ink. When you go looking for it, you will find the smudge. You will find the redaction. You will find the empty space where Tartaria used to be. And you will realize that the most important part of your identity is the part they spent 200 years trying to erase. Ask yourself, what if the registry is about to be rewritten again? What if our generation is the next foundling class? The architecture of the asylum is perhaps the most honest record we have left. Examine the massive, sprawling complexes built in the mid-19th century, the Kirkbride plan buildings with their staggered wings and towering stone facades. We are told these were moral treatment centres for the burgeoning population of the mentally infirm. But look at the technical specifications. Look at the iron piping that predates modern plumbing. Look at the massive copper-domed rotundas. These were not hospitals. They were repurposed processing centres for the holdouts of the old world. The registries show a sudden, inexplicable influx of patients who were neither violent nor demented, but merely delusional regarding their own history. Men and women who claimed to remember the cities of light. Men and women who refused to sign the new birth registries. They were the original political dissidents of the reset. By institutionalizing the memory holders, the state effectively quarantined the truth, not a medical necessity, not a social service, a systematic silencing. What if the very definition of insanity in 1880 was simply the refusal to accept the new map? The technical terms for this are institutional erasure and cognitive enclosure. You take a population, you sever their connection to the land through a series of artificial fires and rezoning laws, and you replace their lineage with a serial number. The 1890 census was not just lost, it was harvested. The data was used to identify the pockets of resistance, the families that still held the old titles, the maps, the scrolls. Once identified, they were liquidated or assimilated. Think about the Great Chicago Fire again. It didn't just burn wood and brick, it burned the registry office. It burned the evidence of who owned the land before the corporatization of America. Ask yourself why the reconstruction of these cities always resulted in a more rigid, more controlled grid. Ask yourself why the new buildings, despite their outward appearance of stone, were often just shells built around the original Tartarian foundations. They were wearing the skin of the empire they murdered, not growth, not progress, something else. The investigate essayist must look at the world's fairs as the final funeral rites for Tartaria. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was a city built of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fibre. Or so they tell us. They say it was temporary. They say it was meant to be destroyed. But look at the photographs. Look at the scale of the machinery hall. Look at the complexity of the moving sidewalks and the electric launches. You do not build a city of that magnitude out of plaster for a 6-month party. You inhabit a city that already exists. You cover the original stone with a layer of cheap white plaster to hide its age, and then you dynamite it to ensure no one can ever study the masonry. The registries of the fair guests show millions of people attending, yet the local housing records don't reflect that capacity. Where did they stay? How were they fed? The narrative is a patchwork of lies designed to make the impossible seem mundane. The fairs were the re-education camps for the masses. Look at what we can build, the new masters said, while they stood in the ruins of what they had just stolen. Consider the orphan trains once more. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were relocated from the East Coast to the rural West. They were placed in homes as indentured labour. Their names were changed. Their birth records were simplified. We are told this was a charitable effort by the Children's Aid Society. But ask yourself, where did all these orphans come from? There were no world wars in the mid-19th century to account for such a staggering number of parentless children. There were no plagues of that magnitude, unless, of course, the parents were removed, unless the foundlings were the children of the Tartarian citizens who had been institutionalized or killed during the reset. You take the children, you move them 1,000 miles away. You give them a new name on a new registry, and you tell them their parents were immigrants who died of cholera. You create a generation of workers with no past, no inheritance, and no questions. You create the modern American. The skepticism of the investigator is fueled by the rhythm of the dates. 1848. Revolutions across Europe. 1850. The start of the massive institutional building projects. 1860. The American Civil War, which conveniently destroyed the records of the southern states. 1870. The unification of Germany and Italy, erasing the old principalities. 1880. The Great Fires of the American cities. 1890. The disappearance of the census. It is a staccato of destruction, a rhythmic dismantling of the global record, not random, not coincidental, synchronized. We are looking at a planetary scale hostile takeover. The foundling hospitals were the intake centres. The asylums were the holding pens. The birth registry was the final seal. It is a sombre realization that our entire concept of heritage is a corporate fiction designed to keep us from claiming our true estate. The urban exploration narrative reveals the physical cracks in this fiction. When you descend into the underground cities of Seattle or Portland, you aren't looking at old storefronts. You are looking at the upper floors of a buried civilization. The street leveling excuse is a pseudo-academic shield. If you level a street, you don't bury 30-foot granite columns. You don't pave over functioning arched windows. You do those things when you are trying to hide the scale of the original structures. You do those things when the buildings are too well constructed to be demolished, so they must be submerged. The registries for these underground areas are often restricted or missing. The institutional gatekeepers say it's for public safety. I say it's for historical security. If the public saw the quality of the masonry beneath their feet, they might start to wonder why their modern skyscrapers are falling apart after 40 years. They might start to wonder who really possessed the technology of the star forts. The tense, mysterious energy of these sites is undeniable. There is a forbidden knowledge that radiates from the stone. It's the knowledge that we are living in a degraded age. We are told we are at the pinnacle of history, yet we cannot replicate the acoustic perfection of the old opera houses. We cannot replicate the durability of the Roman-style concrete used in the Tartarian foundations. We are a disposable civilization by design. If our buildings only last 50 years, our history only lasts 50 years. The registry is refreshed with every demolition. The memory is wiped with every urban renewal project. We are being kept in a state of perpetual newness, a state of forced amnesia that prevents us from realizing we are the rightful heirs to a global empire of free energy and aesthetic grace. Not this, not that. Something else. Ask yourself what the Statue of Liberty actually represents. We are told it was a gift from France, a symbol of freedom. But look at the base. It is a massive 11-pointed star fort. The statue didn't come first, the fort did. The statue is a label placed on an existing Tartarian power node. It is a claim marker. It says, this site now belongs to the new registry. The torch is not the light of liberty. It is the symbol of the illuminated masters who took the old world by fire. The direct and conspiratorial address of the monument is clear to those with eyes to see. It is a trophy. Every domed capital, every obelisk, every star fort is a captured piece of Tartarian infrastructure, rebranded and registered to the new regime. We are the tourists walking through our own stolen house, marveling at the decor, while the owners are buried in the basement. The rhythm of the investigative essayist is one of constant questioning. Why do all the great families of the 19th century have such murky origins? The Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, their rise to power is always described as a rags to riches story, involving a shrewd investment or a lucky break. But look at their connection to the registries. Look at how they were positioned to take control of the foundling labour and the abandoned infrastructure. They were the regional managers appointed by the winners of the 1848 reset. They didn't build the industries. They were given the keys to the Tartarian factories and told to put their names on the letterhead. The Industrial Revolution was simply the process of slapping new logos on old technology. The unresolved philosophical loop at the heart of this part of the journey is the question of who. Who were the architects? If the registry erased them so thoroughly, can we ever know their names? Or were they even people in the sense that we understand the word? The technical terms, cranial capacity, and aptitude for integration from the old asylums hint at a population that was physically different from us, more robust, more attuned to the frequencies of the earth. We are the light version of humanity, bred for the registry, bred for the cubicle, bred for the census. The sombre truth is that the foundlings were not just orphans of a family, but orphans of a species. We are the remnants of a great pruning, and the registry is the fence that keeps us in the garden. The inquisitive mind cannot stop here. We must follow the paper trail into the very heart of the registry itself, the Vatican archives, the City of London ledgers, the District of Columbia vaults. These three independent city-states form the trinity of the New World's administrative power. They are the keepers of the master registry. They are the ones who decide which empires exist and which are relegated to the mythology section of the library. We are taught that these entities are separate, but the architecture tells a different story. They all share the same Tartarian bones. They all share the same obsession with obelisks and domes. They are the three heads of the dragon that swallowed Tartaria, and they are very, very busy making sure you never find the smudge on your own birth certificate. What if the Great Reset wasn't a one-time event? What if the registry is purged every century to ensure no one lives long enough to remember the truth? The staccato of the dates suggests a cycle: 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. Each century begins with a catastrophe and ends with a World's Fair celebrating the new era. Each century sees the erasure of the previous generation's achievements. We are currently approaching the end of a cycle. The registries are being digitized, the physical records are being destroyed, the smart cities are being built on top of the old grids. Ask yourself, what is the smudge that will be placed on your children's records? What part of your world will be called a myth by the year 2010? The investigation is no longer just about the past. It is about the impending erasure of the present. The tense, mysterious atmosphere of the archive grows colder as we realize the scale of the deception. It isn't just a few maps, it isn't just a few buildings, it is a total immersion reality. We are living inside a curated exhibit. The historical mystery is not a puzzle to be solved, but a prison to be escaped. The urban exploration narrative is the first step toward the exit. By touching the stones, by seeing the buried windows, by questioning the registry, we are reclaiming our connection to the empire that was. We are refusing to be foundlings any longer. We are beginning to remember. And that is exactly what the gatekeepers are afraid of. The silence of the 1890s is starting to crack. The ghosts of Tartaria are calling from the basements. Are you listening? Or are you just another name on the list? The institutional gatekeeping of our timeline requires a constant, rhythmic application of force. It is not enough to burn the books once. You must burn the memory of the books every single day. This is achieved through the pseudo-academic language of periodization. We are told that the world is divided into neat, separate boxes: the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Victorian era. But the stone does not recognize these boxes. The load distribution of a cathedral in Moscow is identical to the load distribution of a state capital in Iowa. They were built using the same lost science of geopolymer and resonance, yet the registries assign them to different centuries, different cultures, and different geniuses. Ask yourself why the technical terms for these structures are always shrouded in mystery. They call it sacred geometry to make it sound mystical and unreachable. Not mystical, not sacred. Functional. These buildings were the hardware of a global operating system, and the reset was the ultimate software. Overwrite. By changing the names in the birth registry, they changed the users of the system. We are the unauthorized guests trying to run modern, primitive programs on a supercomputer we no longer understand. Examine the contrast of scale between the human being and the post office. In cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and London, the administrative buildings are gargantuan. The ceilings are 40 feet high. The doors are designed for beings twice our stature. We are told this was monumentalism, intended to inspire awe and represent the majesty of the state. But look at the ergonomics. Look at the height of the original shelving, the placement of the windows, the scale of the stairs. Not for us, not for this version of humanity. Something else. The registries from the 1850s show a peculiar obsession with normalizing the population. They began to standardize everything: clothing sizes, bed lengths, the height of a chair. They were shrinking the world to fit the new, smaller inhabitants, the foundlings who were being harvested from the ruins. We are the standardized generation, living in a world designed for giants, yet convinced that we are the ones who laid the stones. The somber reality is that we are like mice living in the walls of a library, unaware that the marks on the pages are words. The erasure trope is most visible in the great exhibitions of the Southern Hemisphere. In 1879, Sydney, Australia, hosted an international exhibition in a structure called the Garden Palace. It was a massive, domed masterpiece of Tartarian architecture, supposedly built in less than 8 months. In 1882, it burned to the ground. The records of the 1881 census, the early land grants, and the registers of the indigenous populations were all stored there, all gone. Ask yourself why the most important legal documents of a nascent colony were kept in a temporary wooden building. Ask yourself why the fire was so complete that it left nothing but ash and silence. Not an accident, not a tragedy, a clearing of the ledger. By destroying the Garden Palace, they destroyed the connection between the old world of the Pacific and the new registry of the British Crown. They reset the history of an entire continent with a single match. The investigative essayist must follow the money, but in the 19th century, the money was just as fake as the history. The gold standard was the tool used to devalue the real wealth of the Tartarian world, its infrastructure. They took a world where energy was free, harvested from the ether by the copper domes and the star forts, and they turned it into a world where energy had to be mined, refined, and sold. They replaced the atmospheric registry with the carbon registry. To do this, they had to destroy the evidence that a different way of living ever existed. They had to frame the previous civilization as barbaric and primitive. We are told that before the coal-fired engine, there was only the horse and the sail, but the star forts were not built by people who relied on horses. The precision of their fractal moats required aerial surveying and laser-accurate masonry. Not this, not that, something else. The institutional gatekeepers have spent a century trying to explain how pioneers with hand tools achieved what our modern CAD systems can barely map. Consider the rhythm of the foundling narrative. In the mid-1800s, there was a sudden global surge in the construction of massive orphanages. In London, the Coram Hospital. In New York, the Foundling Asylum. In Moscow, the Imperial Foundling Home. These were not small charities. They were industrial-scale processing plants for children. The registries for these institutions are chillingly bureaucratic. The children were often stripped of their names and given numbers or the names of the sponsors who bought their labour. They were the blank slates upon which the new history was written. They were the ones sent into the newly discovered lands of the West and the South to claim the abandoned Tartarian cities. They were told they were settlers. They were told they were civilizing the wilderness. In reality, they were cleaning up the mess left by the reset. They were the janitors of history, and we are their grandchildren. The tense, mysterious energy of this discovery is found in the dead zones of the official record. I visited a municipal archive where the birth records from 1870 to 1880 were restricted due to mould. I asked to see the digital scans, and I was told they were corrupted. This is the modern face of the erasure. It is no longer about fires, it is about bit rot and server migration. They are migrating our history into a format they can edit in real time. If you control the digital registry, you can delete a city as easily as you delete a file. You can erase the word Tartaria from every digitized book and replace it with Central Asia. You can turn a global empire into a nomadic tribe with a single find and replace command. The direct and conspiratorial address of the machine is: trust the database, forget the stone. Ask yourself why the Great Wall of China has its battlements facing inward toward China on the oldest sections. Ask yourself why the maps of the 1700s show it as the border of Tartaria, not China. The registry has been flipped. The wall was not built to keep people out. It was built to keep people in. It was a containment line for the last remnants of the old empire. When the reset was complete, the narrative was reversed. The victors claimed the wall, renamed the land, and updated the birth registries to show that everyone living there had always been Chinese. It is a revisionist documentary written in brick and mortar, and we are the viewers who have forgotten how to read the subtitles. The inquisitive mind sees the pattern of the mud flood as a global baptism. The mud wasn't just dirt, it was the physical manifestation of the system reset. Whether it was a liquefaction event, a pole shift, or a deliberate weapon, it served to bury the ground floor of the previous civilization. It created a literal underworld that had to be forgotten. The registries of the post-flood era are obsessed with sanitation and paving. They were sealing the tomb. Every time you see a basement window at eye level on an old building, you are looking at a headstone. You are looking at the place where the old registry ends and the new one begins. The somber truth is that we are living on a layer of sediment that is only a few hundred years thick. Below that is the truth, and the truth is much bigger than we are. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the question of the next reset. If the 1800s were the century of the fire and the mud, and the 1900s were the century of the wars and the foundlings, what is the 2000s? We are seeing the same patterns repeat: the centralization of records, the destruction of physical books, the orphan train of the digital age, social media, where the younger generation is being severed from the wisdom of the elders. The registry is becoming more granular, more invasive. We are no longer just names on a paper. We are biometrics in a cloud. The clean slate is being prepared once again, not a mystery, not a theory, a cycle. The staccato sentences of the investigator are the only way to keep pace with the erasure. Not this, not that, something else. The stones are still there, even if the names are gone. The star forts are still there, even if they are called parks. The buried windows are still there, even if they are called light wells. The evidence is persistent. It is stubborn. It is waiting for someone who is skeptical of authority to look down at the sidewalk and realize they are standing on the roof of a palace. The birth registry may have erased Tartaria from the minds of the new generations, but it cannot erase the resonance of the truth. We are the investigator. We are the witness. We are the smudge on the certificate that refuses to be wiped away. The institutional gatekeeping of our lineage is not merely a matter of missing paperwork, it is a meticulously maintained vacuum. If you examine the City Beautiful movement that swept across North America at the turn of the century, you are told it was a progressive effort to bring order and aesthetic harmony to the chaotic industrial urban landscape. But look at the technical terms used in the city charters of the time: eminent domain, slum clearance, urban revitalization. These are the linguistic masks of the erasure. In city after city, the grandest Tartarian remains, the massive stone facades, the arched thoroughfares, the integrated subterranean channels were declared blighted or unsafe. They were cleared not because they were crumbling, but because they were inconvenient. They stood as physical contradictions to the story of the primitive 19th century. The registries of these clearances show that the people living in these structures were often displaced with no record of where they went. They were erased from the municipal map to make room for the steel and glass of the new regime. Not an upgrade, not a renovation, a replacement. Consider the Great Reset of the 1870s through the lens of the American Patent Office. In 1877, a fire, predictably, destroyed the Patent Office in Washington, D.C., incinerating over 600,000 models and hundreds of thousands of documents. This was the era of the inventor gods, yet the actual evidence of their prototypes was turned to ash. Ask yourself why the world suddenly forgot how to build monolithic structures that required no mortar. Ask yourself why the science of atmospheric acoustics vanished from the curriculum of the new universities. We are taught that we are moving toward greater knowledge, but the registry shows a narrowing of the mind. We are specialized. We are siloed. The Tartarian masters were generalists who understood that the star fort, the cathedral, and the power plant were the same thing. By destroying the patents of the old world, the new masters ensured that we would have to buy the new technology from them, a technology that was often just a degraded, wire-dependent version of the wireless original. The urban exploration narrative leads us into the ventilation shafts of the old world. In cities like Prague and Vienna, there are tunnels that stretch for miles, lined with white porcelain tile that has no logical reason to exist in a sewer. These tunnels are frequently capped with heavy iron lids and guarded by utility companies that have no public registry of their operations. I spoke with a retired engineer who claimed these were the bus bars of an electromagnetic transit system that once connected the entire continent. He was told to map them for decommissioning in the 1950s. Not maintenance, not repair, destruction. The somber reality is that the modern world is built on the bones of a high-speed, high-vibrational civilization that we are now told was a period of horse and carriage. The contrast of scale between the tunnel and the trolley is the proof of the lie. We are using the veins of a giant to move the blood of a dwarf. The registry of the foundlings is the most unsettling evidence of the genetic reset. Look at the photographs of the orphan train children. Notice their eyes. There is a sense of displacement that goes beyond the loss of parents. Many of these children were not infants. They were old enough to remember, yet they were subjected to re-education protocols that emphasized the new history of the Republic. The registries for these schools, the precursors to our modern public education system, focused on standardization of thought and industrial readiness. They were stripping the Tartarian soul out of the children and replacing it with the worker identity. You take a child who remembers a world of light, and you tell them they are lucky to have a job in a coal mine. You do this for 3 generations, and the memory of the light becomes a fairy tale. The institutional erasure is complete when the victim begins to defend the gatekeeper. Ask yourself why the Royal Geographical Society and its counterparts in the Americas were so obsessed with mapping the interior of the continents in the mid-1800s. They weren't looking for empty land, they were looking for the remaining Tartarian outposts. The frontier wars were not skirmishes with nomadic tribes, they were the final sieges of the star forts. Once a fort was taken, the registry was updated to show it as a frontier outpost built by the cavalry. The history of the West is a sanitized documentary of a global mop-up operation. The skeptical of authority investigator notes that the dates of the Indian Wars perfectly align with the dates of the Great Fires in the cities. It was a coordinated 2-front war against the past. 1 front in the streets, 1 front in the wilderness. The rhythmic staccato sentences of the census takers are the drumbeat of our imprisonment. Name, age, origin, occupation. Each entry is a nail in the coffin of the old identity. By the 1910 census, the word Tartar or Tartarian had been completely scrubbed from the ethnicity column. People who had once belonged to a global empire were now categorized as Russian, Chinese, Turkish, or other. This is the fragmentation of the unified world. The registry was used to create the nation-state, a series of smaller competing boxes that ensured humanity would stay divided and manageable. The forbidden knowledge is that we were once one people under one grid. The tension of the present age is the result of that grid being broken. The unresolved philosophical loop is found in the antique tech that still adorns our most prestigious buildings. Why do the flagpoles on the tops of old city halls look like lightning rods, but with intricate coils and spheres? Why are the spires of our churches always made of conducting metals? We are told it is ornamentation, but in a world of limited resources and high labour costs, you do not spend thousands of man-hours on copper coils for decoration. Not this, not that, something else. They are the receivers, they are the antennas of a dead broadcast. We are living in a world where the power has been turned off, but the equipment is still on the roof, and the registry tells us that the equipment is just a pretty statue. The sombre, inquisitive mind eventually realizes that the birth registry is a contract. By accepting the name and the history given to us by the state, we are agreeing to forget. We are agreeing to be foundlings. We are agreeing that the mud was just street leveling and the fire was just an accident. But the investigator invites you to look at the smudge. Look at the arched window in the basement of your apartment building. Look at the star fort that is now a park with a "keep off the grass" sign. The evidence is not in the books. It is in the discrepancy. It is in the tense, mysterious silence of the archives. The registry is a lie. The stone is the truth. We are reaching the heart of the mystery, where the paper trail ends and the physical evidence becomes undeniable. The next stage of the investigation takes us to the great exhibitions that were never demolished, the permanent structures that were so vast they couldn't be hidden. We will look at the capitals and the universities and the museums not as buildings, but as the captured hardware of the Tartarian world. We will ask why their registries are so carefully guarded and why the people who ask "what if" are so quickly silenced. The journey into the erasure is the journey into the core of our own stolen identity. Ask yourself, If the registry can erase an empire, what else has it erased from your life? The institutional gatekeeping of our geographical reality is perhaps most evident in the classification of the wasteland. If you look at the maps of the mid-19th century, vast swaths of the American West, Northern Asia, and Central Australia are labelled as terra incognita, or unexplored. Yet these are the very areas where the most complex star forts and buried cities are found today by independent researchers using satellite imagery. Ask yourself how a civilization capable of building the transcontinental railroad could be ignorant of the massive stone ruins just 50 miles off the track. Not ignorance, not oversight, a quarantine. The registries of these lands were cleared to create a blank slate for the new narrative of discovery. By labelling an inhabited Tartarian province as a wilderness, the state granted itself the right to settle it, which in technical terms means to occupy, rename, and redistribute the existing infrastructure. This is the erasure trope operating at the scale of entire continents. We are told the pioneers found a vacuum. The stone tells us they found a graveyard. The great surveys of the 1870s were reconnaissance missions disguised as science, rebranding Tartarian ruins as primitive to create a chronological buffer against the truth. Institutions like the New York Public Library were built atop energy nodes to bury physical history under curated data. Even the telegraph was a coup of control. By tethering communication to wires, the new masters monetized and monitored a once wireless world. The rural cemetery movement furthered this erasure, severing ancestral links by moving the dead to the outskirts, leaving the living without a past. World's fairs then showcased temporary palaces, rebranded Tartarian infrastructure, most of which were destroyed to hide their impossible masonry. We are survivors of an unnamed catastrophe, living in a standardized reality designed to keep us small. The modern obsession with sustainability, it mirrors the 1890s urban renewal. It is the language of a new enclosure preparing for the next reset. To investigate is to reclaim a shadow registry of anomalies. We must question the orphan narrative and the state-issued identity. The erasure only succeeds if we agree to stay born into their fiction. The empire isn't dead. It is waiting for us to stop looking away.